Gothic. What does the word make you think of? Most likely, it conjures up imagery of alternative kids with jet black hair, pale makeup, and dark clothing, listening to brooding music in dimly lit clubs. Perhaps you think of towering medieval cathedrals, with their pointed arches and flying buttresses, or maybe even the dramatic novels of the 18th and 19th centuries, filled with haunted castles and supernatural terror. Perhaps the last thing that the word Hittite would make you think of would be one of the great empires of the Bronze Age, a civilization that once rivaled Egypt itself, whose kings corresponded as equals with the pharaohs, and whose armies marched across Anatolia and Syria. Yet, for thousands of years, the Hittites were almost completely forgotten, remembered only through fragmentary references in the Hebrew Bible and mysterious inscriptions that no one could read. When archaeologists first began to uncover their cities and decode their languages in the early 20th century, they revealed a civilization of remarkable sophistication, a people who had mastered the art of chariot warfare, pioneered new techniques in diplomacy, and built an empire that endured for nearly 5 centuries. The Hittites were there at the Great Battle of Kadesh, the most extensively documented military engagement of the ancient world. They witnessed and perhaps contributed to the catastrophic Bronze Age collapse that brought down civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean. They left behind thousands of clay tablets that provide us with an unprecedented window into the political, religious, and daily life of a Bronze Age society. So, who were the Hittites, and how did this once mighty empire vanish so completely from historical memory? The rediscovery of the Hittites is itself a remarkable story that speaks to the fragility of historical memory and the power of archaeology to resurrect lost worlds. Throughout the classical period and the Middle Ages, virtually nothing was known about them. The Hebrew Bible mentioned them in passing, listing them among the various peoples of Canaan, but these references were brief and provided little detail about who they actually were or where they came from. Ancient Greek and Roman writers, who preserved so much knowledge about other Near Eastern civilizations, were almost entirely silent about the Hittites. It was as if an entire empire had been erased from history. The situation began to change in the 19th century as European travelers and archaeologists began to explore the ruins of Anatolia, the great peninsula that forms most of modern Turkey. They encountered strange inscriptions carved into rock faces and monuments, written in a script that bore no resemblance to any known writing system. They found the remains of massive fortification walls and imposing gateways decorated with sculptures of lions and sphinxes. In 1876, a British scholar named Archibald Henry Sayce proposed a revolutionary theory. These monuments were the remains of a great Hittite empire that had once dominated Anatolia. His ideas were initially met with skepticism, but as more evidence accumulated, the case became increasingly compelling. The breakthrough came in the early 20th century, when German archaeologists began systematic excavations at a site called Boğaz Köy, located about 100 miles east of Ankara in central Turkey. What they discovered exceeded all expectations. Boğaz Köy was revealed to be Hattusa, the capital city of the Hittite Empire, a vast urban complex covering more than 400 acres and protected by massive stone walls that stretched for more than 4 miles. Within the ruins, archaeologists discovered something even more precious than gold or monumental architecture, an archive containing thousands of clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform script. These tablets, when eventually deciphered, proved to be the royal archives of the Hittite kings, containing treaties, diplomatic correspondence, legal codes, religious texts, historical annals, and administrative records. They provided an extraordinarily detailed picture of Hittite civilization written in the Hittites' own words. The decipherment of the Hittite language, accomplished primarily by the Czech scholar Bedřich Hrozný in 1915, revealed another surprise. Hittite was an Indo-European language related to Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and eventually to most of the languages of modern Europe. This made Hittite the oldest attested Indo-European language, predating even the earliest Greek texts by several centuries, and it provided crucial evidence for understanding the spread and development of this vast language family. But who were the Hittites before they built their empire? Where did they come from? And how did they come to dominate Anatolia? These questions remain subjects of scholarly debate, complicated by the fact that the Hittites themselves do not appear to have preserved detailed traditions about their ultimate origins. What we can say with confidence is that by the early second millennium before the Common Era, Indo-European speaking peoples had established themselves in central Anatolia, settling among and eventually dominating the indigenous population. These indigenous peoples, who spoke a language called Hattic that was unrelated to Indo-European, had already developed a sophisticated culture with their own religious traditions, artistic styles, and political organizations. The newcomers adopted much from this Hattic civilization, including many of their gods and religious practices, even as they imposed their own language and eventually their own political dominance. This cultural fusion would become characteristic of Hittite civilization, which throughout its history showed a remarkable capacity to absorb and synthesize elements from the various peoples with whom they came into contact. The earliest period of Hittite history, spanning roughly from 1800 to 1600 before the Common Era, is often called the Old Kingdom. This was a formative era during which the Hittites gradually consolidated their control over central Anatolia and began to develop the institutions that would characterize their later empire. Our knowledge of this period comes primarily from later Hittite texts that look back on these early kings, as well as from contemporary documents from Assyrian merchant colonies that had been established in Anatolia. These Assyrian merchants, who maintained trading outposts throughout the region, left behind extensive records written in Old Assyrian cuneiform that provide valuable information about the political landscape of early second millennium Anatolia. From these sources, we learn of numerous small kingdoms and city-states, constantly competing and forming shifting alliances, a political fragmentation that would gradually give way to Hittite dominance. The figure who traditionally marks the beginning of the Hittite kingdom proper is Labarna, a king who appears to have ruled in the mid-17th century before the Common Era. Later Hittite texts remember him as a great conqueror who extended Hittite power from the central Anatolian plateau to the seas, presumably meaning both the Black Sea to the north and the Mediterranean to the south. Whether Labarna actually achieved such extensive conquests is uncertain, as we have no contemporary records from his reign, but he clearly established a strong kingdom that his successors would build upon. The Hittite kings who followed Labarna adopted his name as a royal title, much as Roman emperors would later use Caesar, suggesting the reverence with which he was remembered. His successor, who took the name Labarna II, but is better known as Hattusili I, moved the capital to Hattusa and embarked on a series of ambitious military campaigns that transformed the Hittites from a regional power into a force that would challenge the established empires of the Near East. Hattusili I was a warrior king whose campaigns ranged far beyond the Anatolian heartland. He led his armies south into Syria, bringing him into conflict with the powerful kingdoms of the Levant and northern Mesopotamia. One of his primary targets was the wealthy city of Aleppo, an important commercial center that controlled key trade routes connecting Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean coast. Hattusili besieged Aleppo and eventually conquered it, though the city would remain a source of conflict throughout Hittite history. These Syrian campaigns established a pattern that would characterize much of Hittite foreign policy: the desire to control or at least dominate the wealthy cities of Syria and the Levant, both for their economic value and for the strategic depth they provided against the powerful kingdoms of Mesopotamia and Egypt. However, Hattusili's reign also revealed the internal instability that would plague the Hittite kingdom throughout its history. Succession disputes and palace intrigue were constant threats, and Hattusili himself was betrayed by his own nephew, whom he had designated as his heir. In a remarkable document known as Hattusili's Testament, the aging king disinherited his treacherous nephew and instead appointed his grandson Mursili to succeed him, while also lamenting the disloyalty and ingratitude of his family members. Mursili I, who succeeded his grandfather around 1590 before the Common Era, proved to be an even more formidable conqueror. In one of the most audacious military campaigns of the Bronze Age, Mursili led his army south through Syria and then down the Euphrates River into Mesopotamia, where he attacked and sacked the great city of Babylon. This was an extraordinary achievement. Babylon was one of the most powerful cities in the world, capital of a kingdom that had dominated southern Mesopotamia for over a century under the famous lawgiver Hammurabi and his successors. The Hittite sack of Babylon in 1595, before the Common Era, brought the old Babylonian dynasty to an abrupt end and sent shockwaves throughout the Near East. However, the Hittites did not attempt to hold Babylon or establish permanent control over southern Mesopotamia. Mursili's campaign appears to have been primarily a raid, aimed at acquiring plunder and prestige rather than territory. After sacking the city, the Hittite army returned home laden with treasure, having demonstrated that they could strike at even the mightiest cities of the ancient world. Yet Mursili's triumph was short-lived. Shortly after his return from the Babylonian campaign, he was assassinated in a palace conspiracy, murdered by his own brother-in-law. This assassination inaugurated a period of severe instability and decline that nearly destroyed the Hittite kingdom. For roughly a century following Mursili's death, the kingdom was racked by succession disputes, palace coups, and civil wars. Kings were assassinated with alarming frequency, and the kingdom's power contracted dramatically. The territories in Syria that Hattusili and Mursili had conquered were lost, and even the control over parts of Anatolia became tenuous. This period of weakness allowed other powers to encroach on Hittite territory. The Hurrians, a people from northern Mesopotamia and Syria who spoke a non-Indo-European language, expanded their influence into southeastern Anatolia. The kingdom of Mitanni, a powerful Hurrian state that had emerged in northern Mesopotamia and Syria, became the dominant power in the region, controlling much of the territory that the Hittites had briefly held. Within Anatolia itself, rival kingdoms challenged Hittite supremacy, and there were periods when it was unclear whether the Hittite kingdom would survive at all. The revival of Hittite power came in the mid-15th century, before the Common Era, with a king named Tudhaliya the first, though the chronology of this period remains somewhat uncertain and debated among scholars. Tudhaliya and his successors managed to restore stability to the kingdom and began the process of reconquest that would eventually lead to the creation of the Hittite Empire. However, it was not until the 14th century, with the accession of Suppiluliuma I, around 1344 before the Common Era, that the Hittites truly emerged as one of the great powers of the ancient world. Suppiluliuma's reign marks the beginning of what scholars call the New Kingdom or Hittite Empire period, an era of unprecedented power and influence that would last for roughly 2 centuries. Suppiluliuma was one of the most successful military commanders and diplomatic strategists of the ancient world, a ruler whose achievements can be compared to those of the greatest pharaohs of Egypt or the most powerful kings of Assyria and Babylon. When Suppiluliuma came to the throne, the geopolitical landscape of the Near East was dominated by what scholars sometimes call the Great Powers Club, a system of major kingdoms that recognized each other as equals and conducted their relations through a complex web of treaties, diplomatic marriages, and gift exchanges. The dominant powers were Egypt under the 18th dynasty, Mitanni in northern Syria and Mesopotamia, Babylon in southern Mesopotamia, and Assyria in northern Mesopotamia. The Hittites, though they controlled a substantial kingdom in Anatolia, were not yet fully accepted as members of this club. Suppiluliuma set out to change this situation through a combination of military conquest and shrewd diplomacy. His primary target was the kingdom of Mitanni, which controlled much of Syria and stood as the main obstacle to Hittite expansion southward. Mitanni had been the dominant power in the region for over a century, and it maintained close relations with Egypt, which saw it as a useful buffer against the rising power of the Hittites and Assyrians. Suppiluliuma's campaigns against Mitanni were carefully planned and brilliantly executed. Rather than launching a direct assault on the Mitannian heartland, he first secured his position by subduing various smaller kingdoms in Anatolia that might threaten his rear. He then moved against the Mitannian vassal states in Syria, systematically conquering the cities and kingdoms that had been loyal to Mitanni. The wealthy commercial centers of northern Syria, including Aleppo, Al-Alaq, and Carchemish, fell to the Hittite armies. Suppiluliuma installed his own sons as rulers of the conquered territories, creating a network of loyal vassal kingdoms that would serve as the foundation of the Hittite Empire's control over Syria. The conquest of Syria brought the Hittites into direct contact and competition with Egypt, the other great superpower of the Late Bronze Age. For centuries, Egypt had claimed a sphere of influence over the Levant and southern Syria, and the Egyptian pharaohs were not prepared to accept the sudden appearance of a powerful rival on their northern frontier. The most dramatic moment in Suppiluliuma's reign came in the aftermath of the death of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun around 1323 before the Common Era. According to Hittite records, Suppiluliuma received an extraordinary letter from an Egyptian queen, almost certainly Tutankhamun's widow Ankhesenamun, asking him to send one of his sons to Egypt to become her husband and the new pharaoh. The queen wrote that her husband had died, and she had no sons, and she refused to marry one of her servants, meaning presumably one of the Egyptian nobles who might otherwise claim the throne. This was an unprecedented request. Never before had an Egyptian queen proposed to marry a foreign prince, and if the marriage had taken place, it would have fundamentally altered the balance of power in the ancient Near East, potentially placing a Hittite prince on the throne of Egypt. Suppiluliuma was initially suspicious, suspecting a trap, but after sending an envoy to Egypt to verify the situation, he agreed to the proposal and dispatched one of his sons, a prince named Zananza, to Egypt. Tragically, Zananza never reached his destination. He was murdered while traveling through Egyptian-controlled territory, almost certainly on the orders of Egyptian officials who were horrified at the prospect of a foreign king. The murder of his son enraged Suppiluliuma and led to war between the Hittites and Egypt, with Hittite forces attacking Egyptian vassal states in Syria and the Levant. However, Suppiluliuma would not live to see the full consequences of this conflict. In the later years of his reign, his armies brought back prisoners from campaigns in Syria, and among these prisoners were individuals carrying a devastating plague. The plague spread through the Hittite heartland, causing massive casualties and claiming the life of Suppiluliuma himself around 1322 before the Common Era. His son and successor Arnuwanda II also died of the plague after a reign of only a few years, and it fell to Suppiluliuma's younger son Mursili II to deal with the crisis. The plague continued to ravage the Hittite lands for roughly 20 years, and in several prayers that have survived on clay tablets, Mursili pleaded with the gods to end the pestilence, confessing that he did not know what sin the Hittites had committed to deserve such punishment. Despite the plague and the numerous challenges he faced, Mursili proved to be a capable ruler who maintained and even expanded the empire his father had built. He campaigned extensively to suppress rebellions and secure the frontiers, and he left behind detailed annals of his military campaigns that provide valuable information about Hittite warfare and imperial administration. It was during the reign of Mursili's son, Muwatalli II, that the Hittites fought the most famous battle of the Bronze Age, the Battle of Kadesh, in 1274, before the Common Era. By this time, Egypt had recovered from its internal troubles and was ruled by one of the most ambitious and militarily aggressive pharaohs of the new kingdom, Ramesses II. Ramesses was determined to restore Egyptian control over Syria and to push back against Hittite expansion. In the 5th year of his reign, he assembled a massive army, reportedly consisting of 4 divisions, totaling around 20,000 men, and marched north through the Levant toward the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in Syria. Kadesh was a strategically important city that controlled key routes between Egypt and the Hittite territories, and it had changed hands several times in the ongoing competition between the two empires. Muwatalli responded to the Egyptian threat by assembling an even larger army, drawing on troops not only from the Hittite heartland, but also from the many vassal kingdoms and allied states throughout Anatolia and Syria. The Hittite army may have numbered as many as 40,000 men, making this one of the largest military concentrations of the Bronze Age. The battle that followed was a complex engagement that nearly resulted in disaster for the Egyptians. Ramesses, advancing with his army in multiple divisions spread out along the line of march, was deceived by Hittite agents posing as deserters who told him that the Hittite army was still far to the north near Aleppo. Believing this false intelligence, Ramesses pushed forward with his lead division and established a camp near Kadesh, not realizing that the entire Hittite army was hidden just beyond the city, waiting to strike. As the 2nd Egyptian Division approached the camp, the Hittite chariot forces, numbering perhaps 2,500 chariots, launched a devastating surprise attack, smashing into the Egyptian division and routing it completely. The fleeing Egyptian soldiers carried panic into Ramesses' camp, and suddenly the pharaoh found himself surrounded by Hittite chariots, cut off from the rest of his army, and in mortal danger. What happened next became the subject of extensive Egyptian propaganda. According to Egyptian accounts, Ramesses personally rallied his troops and fought his way out of the encirclement through his own superhuman valor, calling upon the god Amun for aid and single-handedly turning the tide of battle. Egyptian temple inscriptions and the famous Kadesh poem describe Ramesses as fighting like a god, his arrows never missing, his strength inexhaustible, driving back the Hittite forces through his personal prowess. The reality was almost certainly more complex and less one-sided. While Ramesses may indeed have fought bravely in a desperate situation, what likely saved the Egyptian army was the timely arrival of reinforcements, including a force of Egyptian allies who had been marching along a different route, and the 3rd and 4th Egyptian divisions, which finally reached the battlefield. The Hittite chariot forces, having pursued the routed Egyptians and plundered the Egyptian camp, were caught in disorder and driven back. The battle ended inconclusively, with both sides claiming victory. The Egyptians had survived what might have been a catastrophic defeat, but they had failed to capture Kadesh and were forced to withdraw back to Egypt. The Hittites had inflicted heavy casualties on the Egyptians and maintained their control over the disputed territories, but they had failed to destroy the Egyptian army or to kill or capture the pharaoh. In the aftermath of the battle, both sides erected monuments and composed texts celebrating their triumph. Ramesses covered the walls of temples throughout Egypt with scenes of the battle, depicting himself as a heroic warrior who had saved Egypt through his personal courage. The Hittites, for their part, sent letters to their vassals and allies announcing their great victory over the Egyptians. The Battle of Kadesh did not resolve the conflict between Egypt and the Hittites, and fighting continued sporadically for more than a decade. However, both powers gradually came to realize that neither could decisively defeat the other, and that the constant warfare was draining resources that might be better used elsewhere. Moreover, new threats were emerging that concerned both empires. Assyria, under a series of aggressive kings, was expanding westward and threatening both Hittite and Egyptian interests. In 1259, before the Common Era, 16 years after the Battle of Kadesh, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III concluded a formal peace treaty that ended the war and established a defensive alliance between the two powers. This treaty, copies of which survive in both Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions and Hittite cuneiform tablets, is one of the most important diplomatic documents of the ancient world. It is also one of the earliest international peace treaties for which we have the full text, and it established terms that would govern relations between Egypt and the Hittites for the remainder of the Bronze Age. The treaty between Ramesses and Hattusili was remarkably comprehensive and sophisticated. It established peace and brotherhood between the two kings, with each recognizing the other as an equal. It included provisions for mutual defense, stipulating that if either kingdom was attacked by a third party, the other would send military assistance. It addressed the return of fugitives and refugees, requiring each side to extradite individuals who fled from one kingdom to the other, while also guaranteeing that such extradited persons would not be punished. The treaty was sworn by both kings and witnessed by thousands of gods from both pantheons, and it was sealed by a diplomatic marriage, with a Hittite princess being sent to Egypt to become one of Ramesses' wives. This marriage alliance was celebrated with great ceremony, and Ramesses erected monuments commemorating the arrival of his Hittite bride. The treaty held for the rest of the Bronze Age, and Egypt and the Hittite Empire never went to war with each other again. Instead, they maintained diplomatic relations, exchanged gifts and letters, and cooperated against common threats. The reign of Hattusili III, who had concluded the treaty with Egypt, was itself the result of a civil war that had threatened to tear the Hittite Empire apart. Hattusili had been the younger brother of Muwatalli II, the king who had fought at Kadesh, and he had served loyally as a military commander and administrator. When Muwatalli died, he was succeeded by his son Urhi-Teshub, who took the throne name Mursili III. However, tensions soon developed between the new king and his uncle Hattusili, who controlled important territories in northern Anatolia and Syria. After 7 years of increasingly strained relations, Hattusili rebelled against his nephew, defeated him in battle, and seized the throne for himself. This usurpation was a potentially dangerous act that could have undermined the legitimacy of Hattusili's rule, and the king felt compelled to justify his actions in a remarkable document known as Hattusili's Apology, in which he presented his version of events and argued that the gods, particularly the goddess Ishtar, had destined him to become king and had supported his rebellion against the illegitimate Mursili. Hattusili's seizure of power was eventually accepted by the other great powers, including Egypt, and his reign proved to be successful and stable. The Hittite Empire, at its height in the 13th century before the Common Era, was a complex political structure that encompassed a vast territory and numerous peoples. The heartland of the empire was the central Anatolian plateau, where the capital Hattusa was located, along with other important Hittite cities. This core region was directly administered by the king and the royal bureaucracy. Beyond this heartland, the empire consisted of a network of vassal kingdoms and client states that owed loyalty and tribute to the Hittite king but retained their own local rulers and a degree of internal autonomy. The most important vassal kingdoms were located in Syria, where Hittite princes or loyal local dynasties ruled cities like Carchemish and Aleppo. These Syrian vassals were crucial to the empire's power, as they provided military forces for the king's campaigns, controlled vital trade routes, and served as buffers against Egypt and Mesopotamia. The relationship between the Hittite king and his vassals was formalized through detailed treaties that spelled out the obligations of both parties. These vassal treaties, many of which have survived on clay tablets, provide fascinating insights into Hittite political ideology and imperial administration. The vassal treaties typically began with a historical prologue in which the Hittite king recounted the history of relations between the Hittite royal house and the vassal's family, emphasizing the benefits that the Hittites had bestowed upon the vassal. This was followed by the stipulations of the treaty, which detailed the vassal's obligations. The vassal was required to provide military service, to pay tribute, to refrain from independent foreign relations, and above all, to remain absolutely loyal to the Hittite king. The treaties often included specific provisions requiring the vassal to report any conspiracies or threats against the Hittite king that came to their attention, and forbidding them from harboring fugitives from Hittite territory. The treaties concluded with elaborate curse and blessing formulas, calling upon the gods to punish any violation of the treaty and to reward faithful observance. These treaties were not merely formal documents, but were taken very seriously, and the Hittites maintained elaborate archives of treaty tablets, regularly reading them aloud to remind vassals of their obligations. The violation of a treaty was considered not just a political crime, but a religious offense that would bring divine punishment. The Hittite system of government was a monarchy in which the king held supreme power, but it was not an absolute despotism. The king was advised and to some extent constrained by a council of nobles called the Panku, which included important officials, military commanders, and members of the royal family. In the early period of Hittite history, the Panku appears to have had significant power, including the authority to approve or reject the king's choice of heir, but by the time of the New Kingdom, royal power had increased, and the Panku's role had diminished. Nevertheless, the Hittite king was expected to consult with his nobles on important matters, and he could not simply ignore their opinions without risking rebellion. The queen, who held the title of Tawananna, also occupied an important position in the Hittite state. The Tawananna had her own estates and income, played a significant role in religious ceremonies, and could wield considerable political influence. Interestingly, the title of Tawananna did not automatically pass to the new king's wife when a king died. Instead, the king's mother retained the title until her death, which sometimes led to tensions between the king's mother and his wife. Religion permeated every aspect of Hittite life and was central to the functioning of the state. The Hittites worshipped a vast pantheon of deities that reflected the diverse cultural influences that had shaped their civilization. Many of their gods were inherited from the indigenous Hattic population of Anatolia, while others were borrowed from the Hurrians, the Babylonians, and other peoples with whom the Hittites came into contact. The Hittites showed a remarkable religious tolerance and syncretism, readily incorporating foreign gods into their pantheon and identifying them with their own deities. The head of Hittite pantheon was the storm god, known in Hittite as Tarhun, who was associated with thunder, lightning, and rain, and who was seen as the special protector of the Hittite king. His consort was the sun goddess of Arinna, the most important female deity, who was particularly revered by the Hittite queens. These two deities were the focus of the most important state religious ceremonies, and the Hittite king and queen served as their chief priests. The Hittite religious calendar was filled with festivals and rituals that required the participation of the king and queen. These festivals could last for days or even weeks, and they involved elaborate ceremonies including processions, sacrifices, prayers, and the recitation of myths. The king's religious duties were so extensive that they occupied a significant portion of his time, and when military campaigns or other pressing matters prevented him from attending a festival personally, he had to appoint a substitute to perform the rituals in his place. The Hittites believed that the proper performance of these rituals was essential to maintaining the favor of the gods and ensuring the prosperity and security of the kingdom. Conversely, any neglect of religious duties or offense against the gods could bring disaster. When misfortune struck, such as military defeats, plagues, or natural disasters, the Hittites would consult oracles and perform divination to determine which god had been offended and what rituals were needed to appease them. The prayers of Ramesses II regarding the plague that devastated the Hittite lands reveal this religious worldview clearly, as the king desperately tried to understand what sin had brought such punishment upon his people. Hittite society was hierarchical and stratified, with clear distinctions between different social classes. At the top were the royal family and the nobility, who owned large estates, held important offices, and provided the commanders for the army. Below them were free commoners, who formed the bulk of the population and who worked as farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and soldiers. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves, though slavery in the Hittite world appears to have been less harsh than in some other ancient societies, and slaves had certain legal protections and could own property. The Hittite legal system, which we know from surviving law codes and court records, was relatively sophisticated and in some ways remarkably humane. Punishments were generally based on the principle of restitution rather than retribution, with offenders required to compensate their victims rather than suffering physical punishment. For example, a person who injured another was required to pay for the victim's medical care and to compensate them for their lost time and suffering. Capital punishment was reserved for a relatively small number of serious offenses, including certain sexual crimes, sorcery, and rebellion against the king. The Hittite economy was based primarily on agriculture, with the fertile valleys and plateaus of Anatolia producing grain, grapes, olives, and other crops. The Hittites also raised cattle, sheep, and goats, and animal husbandry was an important part of the rural economy. The state controlled significant agricultural resources through royal estates and through the tribute it collected from vassals and subjects. This agricultural surplus supported the palace, the temples, the army, and the administrative bureaucracy. Trade was also important to the Hittite economy. The empire's control over Anatolia gave it access to valuable mineral resources, including copper, silver, and iron. The Hittites were among the first peoples to work iron on a significant scale, and iron objects from Hittite territory were prized throughout the ancient world. However, ironworking remained a relatively rare and specialized craft during the Hittite period, and bronze continued to be the primary metal for weapons and tools. The Hittites also controlled important trade routes that connected the Aegean world with Mesopotamia and Syria, and Hittite cities served as commercial centers where merchants from different regions met to exchange goods. Hittite military power was based on a combination of infantry and chariotry, with the chariot forces playing a particularly important role. The Hittite chariot was a formidable weapon, larger and heavier than those used by some other ancient peoples, typically carrying a crew of 3 men, a driver, a warrior who fought with spear and sword, and a shield-bearer who protected the other 2. These chariots were used in mass charges that could break enemy formations through shock and momentum. The Hittites also employed large numbers of infantry armed with spears, swords, and axes, and protected by shields and sometimes armor. The core of the Hittite army consisted of professional soldiers from the Hittite heartland, but the army was augmented by contingents from vassal states and by mercenaries from various regions. When the Hittite king summoned his vassals for a major campaign, as Muwatalli did before the Battle of Kadesh, he could assemble a truly massive force. The Hittites were skilled in siege warfare and developed techniques for attacking fortified cities, though, like all ancient armies, they found sieges costly and time-consuming and preferred to take cities through negotiation or betrayal when possible. Despite the empire's military might and sophisticated administration, the Hittite state faced constant challenges. Succession disputes remained a chronic problem throughout Hittite history, with royal princes and their supporters frequently fighting for the throne. The vast extent of the empire made it difficult to control, and rebellions by vassals or invasions by external enemies required constant military campaigns to suppress. The northern and western frontiers of Anatolia were particularly unstable, with various peoples known collectively as the Kaska constantly raiding Hittite territory. The Kaska were tribal peoples who lived in the mountains along the Black Sea coast, and they proved to be persistent and dangerous enemies despite their lack of political unity. They repeatedly attacked Hittite cities, and at one point they actually sacked Hattusa itself, forcing the Hittites to temporarily abandon their capital. The Hittites never succeeded in fully subduing the Kaska, and defending against their raids absorbed significant military resources. In the west, the Hittites faced challenges from various Anatolian kingdoms and from peoples associated with the Mycenaean Greek world. Hittite texts mention a land called Ahiyawa, which most scholars identify with the Mycenaean Greeks, and there is evidence of diplomatic contacts and occasional conflicts between the Hittites and Ahiyawa. The final decades of the Hittite Empire, in the late 13th and early 12th centuries before the Common Era, were a time of increasing stress and instability. The empire faced mounting pressures from multiple directions, and the challenges proved ultimately insurmountable. Our understanding of this period is complicated by the fact that it coincides with the catastrophic Bronze Age collapse, a period of widespread destruction and upheaval that affected virtually every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean world. Between approximately 1200 and 1150 before the Common Era, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean civilization of Greece, the great cities of the Levantine coast, and numerous other societies collapsed or were severely disrupted. The causes of this collapse remain debated among scholars, with various theories emphasizing different factors including climate change, drought, famine, internal social and economic problems, systems collapse, and invasions by mysterious groups of raiders whom the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. The last known Hittite king was Suppiluliuma II, who ruled in the early 12th century before the Common Era. The records from his reign reveal a kingdom under severe strain. There are references to military campaigns against various enemies, including naval battles, which is remarkable since the Hittites had not previously been known as a seafaring people. There are also indications of economic difficulties and food shortages, with texts mentioning the importation of grain, possibly to deal with famine conditions. Then, suddenly, the written record falls silent. Hattusa was abandoned and burned, and the great Hittite Empire simply ceased to exist. Archaeological evidence shows that the capital and many other Hittite cities were destroyed around 1200 before the Common Era, with massive burning layers indicating violent destruction. The palace archives end abruptly, and no more royal inscriptions were produced. The elaborate administrative system that had governed the empire collapsed, and the political unity of Anatolia dissolved. Within a generation or two, the Hittite Empire had vanished so completely that later peoples would barely remember it had existed. What caused this catastrophic collapse? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain, and it is likely that multiple factors combined to bring down the empire. Climate studies suggest that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a severe drought during this period, which would have disrupted agriculture and caused food shortages. A weakened and hungry population would have been more vulnerable to disease, less able to support large armies, and more prone to social unrest. The Hittite texts from the final years mention enemies attacking from multiple directions, and the empire may have simply been overwhelmed by the number of threats it faced simultaneously. The Sea Peoples, groups of raiders and migrants who attacked Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levantine coast during this period, may have also struck Anatolia, though direct evidence for this is limited. Some scholars have suggested that the Hittite Empire's elaborate system of vassal states and dependencies made it particularly vulnerable to systems collapse, where disruptions in one part of the empire cascaded throughout the system, causing a general breakdown. Internal political problems, including possible succession disputes or rebellions, may have weakened the empire at a critical moment. Whatever the precise causes, the collapse of the Hittite Empire was swift and devastating. The great cities of the Hittite heartland were abandoned, and the population appears to have declined dramatically. The sophisticated palace economy and administrative system disappeared, and with it went literacy, monumental architecture, and the other hallmarks of Bronze Age civilization. Anatolia entered a dark age from which it would not fully emerge for several centuries. However, the Hittite legacy did not entirely disappear. In southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, a number of small kingdoms emerged in the centuries after the empire's collapse, kingdoms that preserved elements of Hittite culture and political traditions. These so-called Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states continued to use Hittite hieroglyphic script, worshipped Hittite gods, and claimed connections to the old Hittite royal house. Cities like Carchemish, Malatia, and Tabal maintained Hittite cultural traditions well into the first millennium before the Common Era. These Neo-Hittite kingdoms were eventually conquered by the expanding Assyrian Empire in the 9th and 8th centuries, but they played an important role in transmitting elements of Hittite culture to later peoples. The Hittites also left a more subtle, but perhaps more enduring legacy through their influence on the peoples and cultures that came after them. The Phrygians, who established a kingdom in central Anatolia in the early first millennium, inherited some Hittite religious traditions and possibly some political concepts. The Lydians, who built a wealthy kingdom in western Anatolia, may have preserved some Hittite cultural elements. Even the classical Greeks, though they had no direct memory of the Hittite Empire, were influenced by the Near Eastern cultural traditions that the Hittites had helped to shape and transmit. The Hittite system of vassal treaties, with their historical prologues, stipulations, and curse formulas, may have influenced the form of ancient Israelite covenant texts, including possibly some of the books of the Hebrew Bible, though this remains a subject of scholarly debate. The Hittites pioneered diplomatic practices, including the concept of treaties between equal powers and the use of diplomatic marriages to seal alliances that would become standard in the ancient world and beyond. Perhaps most importantly, the Hittites provide us with a sobering reminder of the fragility of civilizations. Here was an empire that dominated much of the Near East for centuries, that fought on equal terms with Egypt, that developed sophisticated systems of government and law, that produced magnificent art and architecture, and that left behind thousands of documents recording their achievements. Yet within a few generations of their collapse, they were almost completely forgotten, remembered only through fragmentary and confused references in the texts of other peoples. It was only through the patient work of archaeologists and scholars over the past century and a half that we have been able to recover their history and to appreciate their achievements. The rediscovery of the Hittites has fundamentally changed our understanding of the Bronze Age world, revealing a more complex and interconnected international system than was previously imagined. The Hittite archives have provided invaluable evidence for understanding ancient diplomacy, warfare, religion, law, and daily life. The decipherment of the Hittite language opened new windows into the development of Indo-European languages and the spread of Indo-European peoples. The study of Hittite art and architecture has enriched our appreciation of ancient Near Eastern culture. The story of the Hittites also illustrates the importance of writing and record-keeping for historical memory. The Hittites were forgotten because their empire collapsed so completely that the knowledge of their achievements was lost. The clay tablets that preserved their archives survived, buried in the ruins of their cities, but there was no one left who could read them, and eventually even the memory that they had existed faded away. It was only because the Hittites had committed their history to writing, and because those writings survived in durable form, that we have been able to resurrect their story. Civilizations that did not develop writing, or whose records were kept on perishable materials that did not survive, have been lost to us far more completely. The Hittites remind us that our knowledge of the past is fragmentary and contingent, dependent on the survival of evidence and the efforts of scholars to interpret it. They also remind us that the great powers and empires of any age, no matter how mighty they seem, can fall and be forgotten. The Hittites were once as powerful and important as any state in their world, yet they vanished so thoroughly that for thousands of years people doubted they had ever existed. Today the Hittites have reclaimed their place in history. We can read their own accounts of their deeds, study their laws and treaties, examine their religious beliefs, and trace their rise and fall. We can appreciate their achievements in diplomacy, warfare, and governance, and we can understand the challenges they faced and the reasons for their ultimate collapse. The Hittites were not merely a footnote in the history of more famous civilizations like Egypt or Mesopotamia. They were a great power in their own right, a sophisticated civilization that made important contributions to the development of the ancient world. Their story deserves to be remembered and studied, not just as a matter of historical curiosity, but because it provides valuable insights into how civilizations rise, flourish, and fall, insights that remain relevant in our own time. The Hittites built an empire that lasted for centuries, developed systems of government and law that were advanced for their time, and created a culture that synthesized elements from many different peoples into something distinctive and original. Then, in a relatively brief period of crisis, it all came crashing down, leaving only ruins and tablets for later generations to puzzle over. Thank you for watching this documentary.